Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Switch Statement Podcast. It's a podcast for investigations into miscellaneous tech topics.
In this episode, we discuss collaboration.
Hey, John, how are you doing?
Hey, Matt, I'm doing very well. How are you?
Doing all right. I don't know. I don't have anything interesting of merit to start. Do you have a good? I don't know. What's going on with your life?
Absolutely nothing. I have an intern at work who this is her last day, and I'm pretty sad about that because she was awesome.
My question to you would be: how did you feel like you and she collaborated in your internship?
Oh, the masterful segue. I thought we collaborated very well. She's an amazing communicator, and we met almost every day. And one thing that she did a very good job of, which I think is very important to collaboration, is she just asked the right questions.
Yeah.
Like, because I think a lot of times as a more junior engineer, you don't really understand why you're stuck. Like, you don't understand the real problem that's occurring that's sticking you. You might understand like some concrete aspects of the problem, but yeah, she just did a good job of kind of pointing us all to the place where we could help unblock her as quickly as possible, which I thought was great. Certainly better than myself when I was a younger engineer. I would always, first of all, I would never ask for help, which is like the dumbest thing ever.
Big problem.
Yeah. No, I know we've discussed this before where both of us are the type of person where we just want to figure it out ourselves. And we always feel like we're bothering people.
This is still a problem. It just so happens that I know enough that it's like not an existential risk for my current job position.
Yeah. Which, maybe is the long game that we pulled because I feel like we're both so good at, problem solving at this point. That sounded like a brag. I guess we're not that good at problem solving. We still run into stuff all the time. But we've definitely built up our problem solving skills over the years of never asking for help.
Well, this is a thing though, and like I think we're at a risk of like idealizing that approach. It's not a good approach though. People out there, don't do it because yeah, maybe we did learn some useful stuff in the like vast amount of wasted time in our careers, but there was also a ton of time, at least I can say this for myself, that I wasted an unbelievable amount of time on stuff that is never going to be useful for me. And I'm just like whiling away in the corner. Like that's never going to amount to anything. And it's never going to be useful for me in the future. And like, that is what you want to avoid.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And please don't emulate us if you're listening to this. If you need help, ask for help. Because the other thing is, the problem that you're stuck on is probably some bizarre esoteric aspect of your system that, as you're pointing out, Matt, like it's just not helpful to know that information.
Right, exactly.
So you majestically segued into the actual topic that we're covering today, and then I immediately sidetracked us. Today we're talking about collaboration.
Yeah, so this was your idea. So I don't know, like just maybe if you want to explain, like, so we're taking a pause from Art of Game Design for one episode.
Yeah, a collaboration is one of those things in our industry that is talked about constantly. And it's this, our industry is very religious in a lot of aspects, and there's a lot of things that are kind of spoken about with this weird reverence. And I just wanted us to break down some aspects of collaboration, truly examine it. I want us to examine whether or not collaboration is actually important. I want to know, when is it important? I want to know, does the industry do a good job incentivizing collaboration? And yeah, just talk about some of these various things.
I mean, I think first off, I want to say like collaboration is obviously crucial. Like, no one is doing anything really amazing alone.
What about the guy who made Stardew Valley?
He is our one, the one reference that we have.
Roller Coaster Tycoon.
Well, okay. So I think roller coaster. I always say roller toaster tycoon.
It should be a roller toaster. Man, that would be a good game.
That would be
Toasters.
interesting. Yeah, everything is toasters.
Yeah.
But from my understanding, the guy who wrote Roller Coaster Tycoon wrote it in assembly.
Yes, he did. So he's clearly a psychopath.
Well, right. I would be afraid of that person if we were to ever meet. But I think that is one of the better examples. Like, or that's one of the closest cases I've seen of someone truly doing it solo. But he didn't design the chip, the information, the ISA of the chip that he was using. He coded against someone else's work for their, uh, you know, yeah, like for whatever the version of assembly he was using.
Yeah.
Like,
Which
he did that.
actually leads to a really important aspect of collaboration, in my opinion, which is the boundary lines of where collaboration is taking place. Like,
Like,
what is.
do you call that collaborative if he was only interfacing with another person via like the formal documentation of like the assembly spec?
It's interesting. I mean, that starts to get philosophical because you could argue like, are we collaborating with the person who invented the English language or whatever? Like, it kind of gets. It quickly becomes just where do you draw that line of like which giant shoulders am I standing on when I'm like building whatever I'm building?
Well, this is okay. So this is an interesting point, and so maybe we do want to kind of separate these terms, where what I'm alluding to is you're relying on the work of another person. Like no person is working in a vacuum. They're not doing it from scratch.
Yes.
But it's possible that they are doing it without talking with anyone else about the project, which and I guess what I'm getting at is I think we probably want to hone in on a definition for collaboration, which is like, yeah, I guess let me turn it over to you. Like, how would you define collaboration?
Well, I think let's just define it how I think it normally takes place in the industry, where you have a team of engineers, maybe product manager, designer, maybe a couple other people, and you're working with these people on a regular basis, usually daily, but maybe slightly less frequently than that. And you are constantly having to take work that one of those other people have done and incorporate it into what you're doing. And you're working on a project that's fluid, constantly changing. So some of the work that people have done in the past that you're depending on might change slightly, and you need to incorporate those changes into what you're doing. So I guess that's sort of how I want to define collaboration, as this like free flow of a small group of people who are creating some singular thing.
Yeah. And to that end, I would say, like, still, aside from Stardew Valley and Roller Coaster Tycoon, the vast majority of, and maybe Jared Sumner, he's the guy who made Bun. And I don't know, he may not even be working. What's that?
Someone was talking about Bun the other day. It's like a bunch of weird names.
Yeah,
Zig,
well,
Bun,
that's the language it's implemented in, I think, Zig.
Zig.
So, yeah, I just think you need collaboration. Like, collaboration is really all about having people with specialized talents do work that is aligned with those specialized talents in a way that allows whoever is working on a particular project to get more done in a shorter amount of time.
Right.
And through that lens, like, I view collaboration as crucial.
Yes. Yeah, and I should say earlier I was kind of trolling. I also view collaboration as crucial. I think it's probably, unless you are some genius that's able to understand every aspect of a major problem and just solve it all yourself over the course of probably, 10 years or whatever, you are going to have to collaborate in order to accomplish anything meaningful. So yeah, I
Even
think
if for no other reason, like if you want this thing to go on like beyond your career, like if you're just working in a vacuum, no one's gonna be able to pick up that torch.
yeah, no, exactly. So yeah, collaboration completely crucial. So I think maybe that can lead right into the next question, actually, which is how well is collaboration incentivized in our industry?
Yeah, so the way I'm interpreting this question is like this feels like it narrows in a little bit on you have an engineering team specifically that is trying to accomplish a task, and is that engineering team working collaboratively just to do the pure engineering part? Is working in that mode incentivized? And I don't think it is really.
Yeah, I this is, and we were talking about this episode beforehand, and I was talking about how maybe I have a little bit of an agenda in talking about this conversation or talking about this topic. But yeah, I agree. I think something that I've noticed over the years is in our industry, there's sort of this lack of connection between collaboration, which is this important method of achieving large goals, versus individual achievement, which is the primary way that careers are understood and the primary lens through which we view, someone's career and promoting someone and rewarding people. Which is a hard problem, right? Because you want to reward people who are good, but you also want your product to be really good. And it's kind of like these two things are at odds.
I guess maybe if we think about it on the flip side, it's like you want at the end of the day, I think everybody wants a team, an engineering team that is high performing.
Right.
And so I think, at least the way that I see this is, if you have someone on the team, like you can have a member of that team that is not really contributing to the efforts of that team, or in the worst case is contributing negatively to the velocity of the team.
Right.
And I think collaboration potentially gets disincentivized because people are worried about losing that signal about if someone is not performing well on the team, so that you can kind of decide whether or not they should be kind of rewarded in the positive case or fired potentially or like if I want to spin this positively, like, or there's someone who needs more support, like maybe that is getting papered over by the fact that people are pair programming all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, so there's a lot of habits that I would say a team can develop that help with collaboration and help improve the overall effectiveness of a team. And these habits are usually a trade-off between one high performer converting a lower performer into a higher performer over time, which I think pair programming can be that. Or, pair programming can also be two high performers just synergizing. But I think, in my first job, for instance, when I was really junior, I did a lot of pair programming with more senior people. And it was definitely an example of, I was a very low performer on the team, not really understanding what was going on. But I was working with someone who had, working knowledge of the product and also just great software engineers. And I was able to pick up those skills much faster than I would have ordinarily been able to pick them up. But I think it was to the detriment of the high performer. I think while they were working with me, they didn't produce as much. So did that hurt their career? Maybe. I don't know. But should it hurt their career? I think absolutely not. I think if you're mentoring someone, then companies need to figure out a way to reward that. just as if they would reward other forms of high performance.
Yeah. And I think this is at risk of painting the industry as like a monolith, like you say, and I guess this is always the case. Like industries are always made up of a billion, like, smaller units.
Yeah.
But I think it's very team by team and manager by manager basis in
Absolutely.
terms of whether or not they're.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. I mean, I've been on teams who are really good at incentivizing collaboration, and they were at big companies or whatever. So I don't think, this is a one-size-fits-all thing.
Exactly. So I don't think there's a systematic problem in the industry. I think sometimes people can fall into that pitfall of not wanting collaboration.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a spectrum, but I do think that there's an interesting trade-off where it's easy to understand individual accomplishment. Or it's easier, I should say. Individuals produce artifacts, they produce lines of code, and you can just look at those and say, okay, this guy had 14 design documents, let's promote him. Collaboration is harder to gauge. How well are my people collaborating? How do you answer that question? So it's, I think it's just harder to reward collaboration, and therefore it eventually becomes less, or it's harder to incentivize because it's harder to measure.
Yeah.
And, there's one thing I believe, and I actually think this is like a universal truth, where companies eventually become whatever they're incentivizing. Mm-hmm. So if companies aggressively incentivize individual achievers, then you're going to eventually have a company of these pure individual achievers who are kind of self-serving and not nearly as collaborative. And this is part of why I love this topic of conversation, because I just think it's so important for companies to find some way of incentivizing collaboration to avoid that, kind of degenerate behavior.
I think this is like data drivenness taken to the trillionth degree. I think a company really needs to leave some room for a manager to give their kind of subjective opinion about the team and the members of the team.
Yeah.
Because any quantification of their members is going to lose some of the kind of important nuance there.
Yeah, and I agree. Like you mentioned, the manager has to be the one to do that. It has to be someone who's like in it and understands the day-to-day, because another thing that some companies do is they have committees that look at people, and the whole point is that the committee doesn't know these people, so they can kind of make an objective decision. And committees are good. I think committees are actually useful for that reason. But at the same time, committees have to just kind of look at raw output. And I think hopefully we're making a case that raw output doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot more to say about that particular topic, but maybe we can move on to the next question, which is, let's assume that collaboration is good, healthy collaboration is desirable.
Yeah.
How do we collaborate better? And this is especially interesting question in the COVID, everyone's isolated world.
Yeah, and actually, one thing, the reason I put this question on here was because I was thinking back on you and I working on Math Chops and working on a couple projects. And in my career, the collaboration between you and I was easily the strongest collaboration I've ever had. Mm-hmm. And I constantly questioned why that was. And I think it's partially just, you and I are friends. We generally agree on a lot of things, which helps. I mean, like, I definitely worked with engineers who are just so stylistically and philosophically different from myself that it makes it harder. But I also think that we did certain things well. I think that we set good boundaries in collaboration. You know, you work on this, I work on this, and we'll meet in the middle. And I think we also made a few decisions early on and stuck with them. And one example I'll give is we used like observables instead of promises in our code. And while that may have made our code a little bit weirder, I think it actually helped with our collaboration, because whenever I was looking at your code, it looked exactly the same as my code. So it just made it easier for me to like read and understand your code quickly. And I think those types of decisions are important. You know, like what idioms are we going to use that will help us read each other's code?
Yeah, I mean, when we were working together, I really was actively trying to be intentional about like, okay, I'm running into a situation where we don't have an established convention. So like, and I think part of it is like you and I really generally like, we're not opinionated about like what the right way to go about a problem is, but like that if like establishing and following the convention as opposed to like coming up with the best possible convention is actually like the best way to do it.
I love that point. Yeah.
And I think that worked really well. And it's like, yeah, maybe now we've learned things. Like I think some of this was my like fear of promises. Like I had never really worked with promises before. I didn't really know like the syntax. Angular uses promises or uses observables like all over the freaking joint. So I was just like, all right, promise or observables everywhere, even on the back end, even when you're handling a single request.
Yeah.
But observables are super powerful. Like they allowed us to do these very cool, like asynchronous processing where we could break things out into a series of like things that we were processing, like merge them back together into this one stream. And so I think, that was useful, that like we had this, we were using the kind of most powerful construct, and like,
absolutely,
it allowed us the flexibility to kind of write these complicated functions.
Yeah. But I think we both, because I had never worked with promises beforehand either. And I think we both kind of forced ourselves to learn observables, which are, I think you could say observables are more complicated than promises. I mean, they're capable of expressing more complicated relationships between asynchronous things.
Yeah.
Which makes them more useful under some conditions. But I think it was kind of a forcing function to make us both better at asynchronous programming. And I do remember some pretty heinous bugs where it was like, what is this 80-line, promise graph like thing doing? Or promise graph is the Google version of this, but what is this 80-line crazy version of observable chaining actually doing, and why is it not producing anything? I remember bugs like that, but
yeah, that is true. But there was also something really satisfying about getting this Rube Goldberg of an observable like all plumbed through correctly. And I will say, like, I've heard people say this about Haskell, where like once it compiles, it's right. It's kind of like, I feel like observables had that to, I would say, a lesser degree. It's not like it compiles and it's right, but like once you hook up all of the like observable chain correctly, like it kind of just like flows through. Like once you do that, it's like less likely that something small was going to be like wrong with it, and it was probably just going to like start working in pretty much all the cases. Because I feel like in imperative code, like you could wind up with some weird like edge case where like it's it just does something weird,
right? But I want to go back to what you said before, because I think it's so important to collaboration, and that is, and maybe this isn't exactly what you're saying, but compromise, like being practical about situations and being able to meet in the middle. you might have a slightly different stylistic way of doing something than your teammates, but it's okay to sacrifice that. Like I would be, because constantly we would have these conversations where we would be like, hey, how do you want to do this? And you would want to do it one way, I would want to do it the other way. And we would both just be like, okay, whatever, let's just flip a coin. Because you and I are both very practical. We just want to solve the problem. We don't care about some kind of philosophical ideal way of solving it. And I think that's truly important because something that you learn as you do this more and more, or at least I feel I'm learning, is that there just is no right or wrong answer a lot of the time.
Yes.
It's just find an answer and stick with it and be consistent.
Well, and okay, so there's a couple of responses I have to that. There's this idea, and I think this is from Jeff Bezos, which always feels like a little weird using some of his mind, his like thought.
Evil capitalist overlord Jeff Bezos,
yeah. But it's at Amazon. The idea is disagree and commit, and I think that's exactly what you described. It's like, okay, it's okay if there's disagreements, but like, do something, because you can get caught up in like, always trying to arrive at consensus, and then you just never make a decision.
Yeah. And just keep in mind that the time you're spending disagreeing is not productive. I see this all the time where I'll be looking at a code review and there will be two engineers having a flame war about like where to put a new line or something dumb. I mean, I guess that doesn't come up because there's code formatters, but you know what I'm saying? Like if it'll just be some idiotic detail of the code and it's just like, guys, this is a waste of time.
Yeah.
Just pick something and run with it.
Yeah. I think, I just had a thought. Yeah. I mean, I think what it comes down to is also like having like a humility about your solution. Like I think some people like they come up with a solution. They're like, this is beautiful and perfect and it's going to work in every situation and it's going to be, and then like they're married to their own beautiful solution. And it's like, yeah, of course there's going to be this jihad over like what way we should do this when you're like really invested in your own solution. But it's like, I think it's really healthy to like put a little gap between you and your proposed solution.
Yeah.
And like also have like the ability to be like, hey, I think this is going to apply to this situation, but I know that it's unknowable essentially, like whether or not it's actually going to be right once we put it out there. And I think the best thing to do is to, okay, everyone agrees that like this approach isn't like absolutely terrible. Mm-hmm. Let's move forward and see how the real world, what the real world thinks about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and that's such an incredibly important thing to programming is like, the user is not reading your code. They're just using whatever product, your code is like a tiny piece of whatever product the user is using. And, at the end of the day, that these little things don't matter. I want to quickly chat about boundary lines because this was something I thought was really important for collaboration.
Boundary lines. Okay.
And boundary lines. And what I mean by that is, there's simple boundary lines where you have a code base and, one engineer is building the vector math and another engineer is building, a rendering library. I don't know. These are bad examples, but, the rendering library is obviously going to be using that vector math library a ton. And that,
or just maybe like like someone who's writing the server API, and then there's the client consuming the API, maybe, or like
anyway, like that's like, better. That's simpler. So, but I think there's a key where you need to write your server essentially in a way that your teammates can use it easily. They don't have to read what you're doing. You basically need to design a nice little black box for your teammates. And I think this concept can be thought about at scale where, I've seen teams of, many engineers where these boundary lines aren't set up well, where, you have to have full stack engineers because the API is not defined well enough to where engineers have to be constantly working in the API and like writing new endpoints and Trying to understand current endpoints because they're not documented well enough or they're not named well enough. And I think this all comes back to these boundary lines where you need to be clean about them. You need to have them be well defined. And you need to make sure that if team A is going to need, some API that team B is experts in, team B needs to write that API before team A needs it.
Yeah, this is a really good and like massive point that you're making here.
Yeah.
But yeah, like this has come up in so many different ways in my current job where and I want to sit down and think about what I think the right best way to do this is. Like, so on my current project, the breakdown was basically I was working on the client and then another engineer was working on the server API. And like, there was all of this friction back and forth because like I was calling his API in ways that like he wasn't expecting me to. And it took so many rounds of refinement until like it was actually like they were actually speaking the same language. The other thing that was hilarious is like, he had a bunch of unit tests on his API code. I had a bunch of unit tests on my code, which was kind of like mocking the interaction with the API. And of course, they're expecting different behaviors, so it's like, yep, I wrote my unit tests, the user tests are passing. Yeah. Like, as long as the client calls me in this way, like, yep, I'm doing the right thing. And it's like, oh, as long as the server returns this response, like my code is working. And of course, like they're not doing, they're not speaking the same language. And I just wonder, it made me wonder, like, should one engineer like own, like, I think you could think of it as a couple different ways. Like, one engineer owns like the client or the server, or like an engineer owns the integration. You know what I mean? The engineer owns like, both sides. And actually the edge is what the engineer is working, the communication edge.
Yeah.
And like, maybe it's better if one engineer, or like maybe it's more efficient if one engineer is kind of defining, both sides of that interaction. And to your point about like full stack engineers.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because this actually all goes back to what I think the most important aspect of collaboration is, and that's communication. The overarching ideal thing is communication. And that can take so many different forms. But one of them is, a design document. And I think being able to, like, API definitions are so important. If you're writing a server and you have APIs that are meant to be called by, some front end or some other engineers, the definition of that API and everyone being able to understand it and know exactly what it's doing is paramount. And I think a lot of times it's easy to make little sacrifices here and there, like, oh, the work will get done a little bit faster if we compromise a little bit and maybe that our API is slightly less easy to understand. Those compromises are, I think they're a version of tech debt that has very high interest. So I think, and I think that just comes back to communication, being able to say, I'm going to write this API, it's going to do this. And your client engineers saying, well, I think it should do this, and kind of going back and forth until there's this very strong understanding of like what the API is doing. But obviously that's easier said than done. I think like I don't think I've ever worked with an API where that is done perfectly, because there's always little complications and edge cases that come up, and it's impossible to define an API that's just completely understandable by every single person that uses it.
The other thing is like, I think there's a real risk to trying to design an API without a client.
Yeah.
Because you're just going to design an API that like is just not useful.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And is just like a weird shape. But one thing I do want to like, I want to point out about what I was saying before, where like it might be more efficient for a person to own both sides. I actually think that it's worse in the long run if one person owns the integration, actually.
Yeah.
Because I think what you're going to wind up with is a hyper specialized API endpoint.
Yeah, I agree.
And actually, I think it's slower to do it the way we did it, but I actually think it's better because like you need two people to kind of like come to an agreement. It's basically like, okay, let's have two people like figure out if this is like a reasonable way for these two sides to interact, as opposed to just like one person having their kind of like weird like arcane understanding of like the way that it's supposed to work, and it's like it doesn't make sense to anyone else. They have like bad names for things and like confuse like the two people version like allows there to be this like you kind of pay that tax up front like figuring out if it's like if it's understandable.
Yes. Yeah, I think I always make fun of design by committee. I think it's like so stupid in so many different cases, but for an API, design by committee, because it needs to be something that most people can just understand on the face of it. And, designing by committee is one way to achieve that. So I think as you're saying, it's always better to have multiple people working with an API at once. And it's always better to have users almost immediately for an API, because that's how you figure out what the problems are. You're not going to figure out the problems by writing unit tests. You're going to figure out the problems by having users screw with your API and use it in ways that you never thought of. And that typically happens very quickly after an API is launched.
All right. Yeah, I think I think that was basically the core questions, unless was there anything else you wanted to chat about collaboration?
Yeah, I feel like we just scratched the surface on so many of these topics, but I thought it was a good conversation. I mean, we chatted about incentivizing collaboration, which I think is so important in the industry. And we chatted about these things that I think boost collaboration so much that probably, most teams should consider doing. So I thought this was very good.
Yeah. I feel like there's room for like a collaboration too. I don't know. I feel like there was a lot of, different avenues to look at it. One of the things that we wanted, or that I wanted us to talk about, is like collaboration patterns. So maybe that's a teaser for a potential future. Because not to like inject content right at the end, but I think the API that we talked about, like I think you could view that as like a collaboration pattern, where it's like, okay, the pattern is that if you're working on an API, you don't either make the pitfall of not having a client first, or like simultaneously, but also the other pitfall is like having one person design both the client and the API. Like I feel like, and I guess that's a pattern expressed by its pitfalls. So maybe that's kind of like an awkward way to convey it, but like I think you can kind of understand that, like and I think there's probably a billion different of these things. I haven't thought about it. I should do some background research, but just things that wind up with the best results, and then talking about like, okay, well, the downside is it's slower, but the upside is, better APIs in the long run, or what have you. So
well, I think that's a very good cliffhanger. So I do think we should talk more about collaboration at some point, and collaboration patterns would be an awesome topic for that.
Maybe there's a whole book. We should look into it. Maybe we can kind of use another text as our kind of nucleation point.
Love it.
All right, but we'll see you all next time on Switch Statement.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I'll see you, Matt.
All right, see ya.